Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Tyler of the SEC Nation podcast. This is episode 2 of the podcast. Today, we're going to be going over the SEC East predictions for the 2019 season. Before we get started, I just want to go over some quick changes I'm making. If you watched the first episode, you would have noticed that I had video highlights in the episode. I'm not going to be doing that just to save time on the editing process. And instead of going over each game for each team on wins and loss, I'm just going to be highlighting the most important games for each team to also save some time in the editing process. I'm going to try and keep these episodes a lot shorter than the first one was, just again to save time on the editing part of it all. Coming into 7th in the East, I have Vanderbilt coming off a 6-7 season, going to their second straight bowl game. You do lose your quarterback Kyle Shermer. You also lose Ladarius Wiley at safety, and you're losing 3 starters on the offensive line. You are returning 7 starters on offense, including Keyshawn Vaughn, who had over 1,200 yards rushing last year, 12 touchdowns, and was 5th in the country in yards per carry with 8 yards per carry. That was also 1st in the SEC. And you're also bringing back senior tight end Jared Pinkey. You have Riley Neal, the grad transfer out of Ball State, who has nearly 8,000 yards passing, 46 touchdowns, and 25 interceptions. He has completed 60% of his passes. You would like to see that touchdown to interception ratio be just a little better. Throughout the years under Derek Mason, you've seen Vanderbilt struggle on defense. Derek Mason believes the struggles over the recent years were due to lack of size. That's a quote according to Athlon Sports. Vanderbilt did add a little more weight to their defensive line. You got grad transfer Eddie Zen-Turner, who's 6'1", 315, and you got the JUCO transfer Brandon Maddox, who's 6'3", 285. So you do have a little more size on that defensive line. I do expect Vanderbilt to take a step back. I don't think they're going to make a bowl game this season. However, if they do, it will be because of the senior leadership on that offense between Vaughn, Neal, Lipscomb, and Pinkey. I just don't see the defense getting better this year, but I do think in the long run, the Vanderbilt defense will eventually get a lot better. So I have Vanderbilt going 4-8, finishing 1-7 in the conference. I have you losing to teams like Georgia, at Ole Miss, at Florida, and I have you going 4-8 overall, 1-7 in the conference. I just think it's a really tough road schedule this year. You got to play at Ole Miss, at South Carolina, at Florida, and at Tennessee. That's 4 very tough road games. You open the season off with Georgia. That's also a very tough start to the season. Like I said, I think Vanderbilt's going in the right direction. I just think they're going to take a step back compared to last year, and I'll probably see them playing for bowl eligibility next year. Okay, coming into 6th in the East, I have South Carolina. You have 12 returning starters, 7 on offense, 5 on defense. You are losing your star receiver, Deebo Samuel. You also only have 2 returning starters on the receiver position. You are bringing back Jake Bentley for his senior season, who threw for 3,171 yards passing last year, had 27 touchdowns, but also had 14 interceptions. You would like to see that interception number get a lot lower. The biggest concern for South Carolina really is they just haven't been able to show up against ranked opponents. You have Jake Bentley, who is 1-11 versus ranked teams, and you have Will Muschamp throughout his career is 6-24 versus ranked teams. That's not good, guys. You're bringing in senior wide receiver Brian Edwards. Him and Jake Bentley, I think, is a very good combination in the pass game. They're bringing back the son of New Orleans Saint Joe Horn's son, J.C. Horn at cornerback. And I like Parker White, went 3 for 16 in kicking last year, also bringing him back. According to Will Muschamp, this is the deepest team they've had, and they're a lot more competitive on depth at every position. The running back position has a lot to prove this year. They were only 12th in the SEC in rushing, and South Carolina has to take care of the ball better last year. They were 12th in the SEC in turnover margin. My biggest issue with South Carolina is Will Muschamp. I've never liked Will Muschamp as a Power 5 head coach. I don't think he will ever build a contender team in the SEC. I don't like Will Muschamp as a Power 5 head coach. Like I said, he's 6-24 throughout his career versus ranked teams. He's 1-11 versus ranked teams at South Carolina. He's 4-12 against top 10 and 0-6 versus the top 10 at South Carolina. He's 13-18 on the road, and he's 5-9 on the road while coaching at South Carolina. That's not good numbers when you're coaching in the SEC. I do, however, think South Carolina's going to have a good season. The biggest issue for South Carolina this year is the schedule. You have to play Alabama, at Missouri, at Georgia, Florida, at Tennessee. That's a 3-game stretch at Georgia, Florida, at Tennessee. That's a hard 3 straight games. Then you end the season with at Texas A&M. You get a bye and then finish with Clemson. I said on the last episode, Texas A&M has the hardest 2 final games. South Carolina probably has the second hardest 2 games, with at Texas A&M and then Clemson. So I have South Carolina going 6-6 overall, finishing 3-5 in the SEC. Your biggest win I have for you is probably at Missouri. I don't think this is a bad team necessarily for South Carolina, just the schedule really hurts you, and I don't know what to expect out of the offense. Jake Bentley is a much better quarterback than people think, and he does have Brian Edwards at receiver there for him. Like I said, they have to get something going in the run game, and they have to take care of the ball better. The defense hours should be good, and if they surprise anybody, and if they get any surprise wins, I do think it will be mostly because of the defense. Okay, finishing 5th in the East, I have Kentucky. You have 8 returning starters overall, 4 in offense, 4 in defense, where you're losing your star players on both sides of the ball, Benny Snell Jr. and Josh Allen. You only have 2 returning starters on the offensive line. You only have 1 returning starter at wide receiver. You have 0 returning starters in the defensive secondary. All of that is concerning for Kentucky. You do, however, bring back Terry Wilson at quarterback for his junior year. He completed 67% of his passes last year, but only had 11 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. You would like to see those numbers be a lot better. You're bringing back senior linebacker Cash Daniel, who I really like. And you have junior wide receiver Lynn Bowden, who finished 5th in the SEC in all-purpose yards. He's coming back for his junior year for Kentucky. And you have senior defensive end Calvin Taylor coming back. Now, the big question is can you replace Benny Snell at running back? I think A.J. Rose is a good replacement. He's no Benny Snell. I think he's going to work out just fine for Kentucky. I think the run game is going to stay pretty decent. It's just you can't be one-dimensional, and you need Terry Wilson to improve in the passing game. So I have Kentucky finishing 7-5 overall, 3-5 in the conference. The best game I have for you winning is Missouri, but there are some games I think Kentucky can be very competitive and possibly win. You always seem to give Florida trouble, especially in Lexington. You play at Mississippi State, at South Carolina, and Tennessee. That's 4 games I have you losing, but I wouldn't be surprised if Kentucky won any of those 4. I think those games are going to be a lot closer than people think, especially the Florida game. I do think Kentucky's going to still be pretty good on defense. Not as good as they were last year. You had a historically good season on defense last year. I think you're going to take a slight step back on defense. I don't think Kentucky's going to fall off. I wouldn't be surprised if they won 8, possibly 9 games. I don't think they'll win 8 or 9. That's why I have them at 7-5, obviously. But I wouldn't sleep on Kentucky this year, even with a 7-5 record. I think they're going to be a pretty tough team to beat. But for right now, I have you going 7-5. I would not be surprised at all if they win more games than that. Coming in the 4th in the East, I have Tennessee. You have 15 returning starters, 8 on offense, 7 on defense. Now that sounds great, but the 3 you're losing on offense are all offensive linemen, and you had quarterbacks scrambling for their life last year. The offense was already struggling last year, and now you're losing even more depth. You're also losing 4 starters on the defensive line, like defensive lineman Kyle Phillips and Shai Tuttle. You're bringing back Jarrett Garantano for his junior year, and a running back I think is very underrated. You're bringing back Ty Chandler. You're bringing back senior wide receivers Marquez Callaway and Jawan Jennings, who feel like they've been there for 10 years at Tennessee. That's 2 very good receivers, though. You also have sophomore cornerback Bryce Thompson, who was on the All-American freshman team last year. He's a very good defensive back. You have a pretty big hire for the offensive coordinator, I believe, with Jim Chaney. I think Jim Chaney did an excellent job at Georgia. Georgia was 2nd in the SEC in scoring last year. I think that's a really good pickup for Tennessee. The biggest concerns I have for Tennessee is at quarterback. Behind Garantano, you don't really have much. And the offensive line, I think, is the biggest concern on the whole team. Like I said, you had Garantano scrambling for his life last year. You're losing even more players on the offensive line. If Garantano gets hurt or just isn't the guy at quarterback, that's a bit concerning because there's just nothing behind him. You don't have a single quarterback that has any college football experience behind Garantano. The passing game has to get better. Not entirely his fault when the offensive line can't block for him. You do have a lot of talent at receiver, but like I said, quarterback, offensive line, and defensive line also is a big question mark for Tennessee. If you struggle on the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball, that's a huge problem for you in the SEC. I still think this is a rebuild process for Tennessee. Right now, I have them going 7-5 overall, 3-5 in the conference. Your best win I'm giving you is Mississippi State at home. I think you do also have a pretty tough road schedule. You have to play at Florida, at Alabama, at Kentucky, at Missouri. That's 4 pretty tough road games. I have you losing all 4. I would not be surprised if you beat Kentucky or possibly Missouri. You should finally end your losing streak to Vanderbilt. Depending on how Vanderbilt looks, that may not be the easiest game for you. Like I said, I have Tennessee going 7-5, 3-5 in the conference. Moving on to Missouri, you do lose Drew Lock at quarterback, which is huge, but you're bringing in Kelly Bryant from Clemson, which is a huge transfer. You're losing Terry Beckner on the defensive line and Emmanuel Hall at receiver. You do have Larry Roundtree, the junior running back who had a big breakout season last year, rushing for over 1,000 yards and 11 touchdowns. The senior transfer quarterback, Kelly Bryant, threw for 3,338 yards passing with 16 touchdowns and 10 interceptions. You would like to see that touchdown to interception ratio improve a little bit. I think the biggest return on the whole team is middle linebacker Cale Garrett, returning for his senior season. He was 5th in the SEC in tackles, and you bring him back both your starting quarterbacks, so it's also big. Missouri really needs to develop a pass rush. They were 108th in the country last year in sack rate. That number definitely needs to improve. Kelly Bryant is going to give Missouri a much different look on offense, with him running the ball a lot more than Drew Lock did. Missouri is a very talented team, especially on defense. Right now I have them at 9-3. Overall, 5-3 in the conference. I would not be surprised if Missouri finished 10-2 and possibly finished second in the East. Your biggest win I have for you is I think you will get the win against Florida at home. That's a game in November. It should be cold in Missouri. Florida's not used to playing the cold weather. And with that inexperienced Florida offensive line, I don't know how they're going to be looking by game 9 in the year. They could be banged up and even thinner than they are now. I think that's a bad matchup for Florida against Missouri's defensive line. I do believe Missouri can win that game. But like I said, I have Missouri going at 9-3 overall, 5-3 in the SEC. I would not be surprised if they win 10 games this year. Okay, coming into second in the East, I have Florida. You have 12 returning starters, 5 on offense, 7 on defense. The biggest loss Florida has that everyone's been talking about is you have to replace 4 offensive linemen. Having a thin offensive line is probably the last thing you want to have in the SEC. Florida plays some really tough defensive lines, including the season opener coming up this weekend against Miami. You have to play Auburn, LSU, Missouri, and Georgia's defensive line is supposed to be improved. That's 4 or 5 really good defensive lines that this offensive line has to play. You're losing defense back Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, led the team in interceptions. You're losing Ja'Kai Polite on the defensive line, who led the team in sacks. And you're losing linebacker Voshon Joseph, who led the team in tackles last year. You're losing the players that led your team in interceptions, tackles, and sacks last year. I do think Florida's defense is going to be fine. I think it's going to look even better than last year. You're also losing C.C. Jefferson on the defensive line, and you're losing Jawan Taylor on the offensive line. You're also bringing back C.J. Henderson at the cornerback, who could be a first-team All-American when the season's over. Michael Pirine at running back, who I think is very underrated. You got Jabari Zuniga coming to the defensive end, and Florida is absolutely loaded this year at receiver. The 2 best ones are probably Van Jefferson, Tyree Cleveland, and Kadarius Toney. You have David Reese coming back for his senior season at linebacker, and junior quarterback Felipe Franks is supposed to be much more improved. He had a significant improvement last year compared to the 2017 season. The biggest thing is Florida's returning 7 receivers. Like I said, the biggest ones are Van Jefferson, Tyree Cleveland, Kadarius Toney. But one I think people need to look out for is Jacob Copeland, who did not play last year. I think the whole season for Florida could seriously come down to the offensive line. You can't do anything offensive. You can't do anything in the run game or the pass game if your offensive line is not blocking for you. It does not help to have closed holes in the run game. And it doesn't help to have your quarterback scrambling for his life. So the offensive line definitely needs to show some growth. and it needs to show growth quick. Like I said, if Florida's offensive line is just a little bit above average, I think we could see a pretty good year for Florida, especially on the offense. Another issue I think with Florida's schedule is you play your toughest games on the road. You got to play Miami, Georgia, and LSU all away from home. You also have to play at Missouri. Your biggest opponent at home is probably Auburn and Florida State. Another thing, I did decide to go back and change my Auburn-Florida pick. If you listen to the first episode, I said Auburn would beat Florida, but I decided to change my mind. I think Florida will beat Auburn at home. That's probably the best win I have for Florida. There is another win I have for Florida, but I'm going to mention that when I get to Georgia. I do think Florida will beat Florida State again. I do think Florida will beat Miami. They will beat Tennessee, Auburn, but will lose to LSU. If Florida's offensive line is struggling this year, they can easily lose games to teams like at Kentucky, Auburn, and even South Carolina and Georgia. But I do have Florida going 10-2 overall, 6-2 in the conference. If the offensive line, like I said, is a little bit above average, Florida could easily go 11-1. Another issue for Florida is all the transfers and decommitments they had, especially at the defensive back position. This is looking like a very thin defensive secondary for Florida, which is very rare to see. The starters are fine. It's just you got to really hope they stay healthy. But like I said, I have Florida at 10-2. Your best win is Auburn. Also, like I said, if the offensive line is struggling, you can lose to teams like Miami, Kentucky, Auburn, South Carolina, and Georgia. Florida can go from anywhere between 10-2, 11-1, or possibly somewhere as bad as 7-5. I don't think they'll struggle as bad as 7-5. I think worst case scenario, they'll probably go 8-4. I wouldn't be surprised if Florida just repeated what they did last year and went 9-3. But I have you going 10-2 at the end of the 2019 season. Okay, moving on to first in the East, I have Georgia. Probably not a very big surprise to many people. The biggest concern for Georgia is at the wide receiver position. You have 0 starting receivers or tight ends returning, so that's a big concern. You're also losing DeAndre Baker at cornerback. You're losing wide receiver Riley Ridley, but you do have Jake Fromm at quarterback. It all just depends how much help does he have at the wide receiver position. Now you have DeAndre Swift at running back, who I think can be a Heisman candidate if he stays healthy, because he's going to be running behind possibly the best offensive line in the entire country. I think he's going to have a huge season. And like I said, I think he can be a Heisman finalist. Georgia is looking pretty stacked on defense. The only concerns is the defensive line. The defensive line hasn't improved from last year. They were only 12th in the SEC in sacks, and they were only 13th in the SEC in tackles for loss last year. That has to improve. Jake Fromm is a very talented quarterback. If he has no help at wide receiver, though, that's going to be a problem. I don't think he will have that much of a problem. I think Georgia's going to be just fine. So I have Georgia winning the East, going 11-1, and 7-1 in the conference. Like I said, with Alabama, I don't like picking teams to go undefeated. I would not be surprised if Georgia did go undefeated, but I think it's boring to pick teams to go undefeated in the preseason. The team I think most likely to beat Georgia would be Florida. If not Florida, I would say Notre Dame. But since the Notre Dame game was at home, I'd give Florida the edge in that, since that is a neutral site game and you're not at home. Another game you could possibly lose would be at Auburn. I think you will win that game. And another tough game would be Texas A&M at home. But with that being at home, I think you'll win. So I have Georgia winning the East, playing Alabama in the SEC Championship. For the third year in a row, you're playing Alabama. I'm going to say the third time's a charm. Georgia wins the SEC Championship. I don't think they're going to lose to Alabama 3 times in a row. If you blow another double-digit lead for the third straight year to Alabama, that's very depressing. But I have Georgia winning the SEC. I would not be surprised if Alabama still goes to the playoff if they lose to Georgia. Other contenders I can see for the SEC Championship would obviously be LSU and Florida. Watch out for LSU if they go 11-1. Even if they're not in the SEC Championship at 11-1, they could possibly still find a way to get into the playoff. We saw Alabama do that 2 years ago. So that wraps up my predictions for the 2019 season. I don't know much about what I'm talking about. Like I said, these are just predictions. It's just the preseason. I have no idea how this season's going to turn out. We may not even see Georgia or Alabama in the SEC Championship. But I'm really excited for this year. I'm excited to keep doing this podcast with you guys, and it's going to get a lot better throughout the year. Before we end the show, I want to talk about the Florida-Miami game coming up this Saturday. Starting right off of the season, this is a huge test for Florida's offensive line. Miami might have the best defensive line in the country. It was one of the best defensive lines in the entire country last year, and they're returning a lot of players. Offensively, I think Florida is a much better team than Miami. Darren Williams is supposed to be a very talented quarterback, but Florida is way more loaded at wide receiver than Miami is, and I like the running package from Florida a lot more than Miami's. I think Miami has a slight edge in the offensive line position. Their offensive line is also not supposed to be that deep. Miami definitely has a lot more talent at the linebacker position than Florida does. That's not a knock on Florida. That's just how good I think Miami's linebackers are. You have Michael Pickney at linebacker, who is a preseason first-team All-ACC linebacker, and you got Jaquil Quarterman, who is supposed to be one of the best linebackers in the country. Florida just has David Reese, who is a very good linebacker, but you don't have much behind him. Florida's defensive secondary, the starters, I believe, are better than Miami's. On the defensive line, I also forgot to mention Miami has Jonathan Garvin on the defensive line. He is also a preseason All-ACC defensive lineman. I think it's going to be a very close, low-scoring game. I wouldn't be surprised if both teams score under 20 points. I do think Florida definitely has the edge I definitely think Florida has the edge in the coaching position. Manny Diaz is a first-year head coach at Miami. I think he's going to be very good at Miami, but it's very hard to win your first career game at head coach, and the first team you play is Florida. I think Dan Mullen is very aware of the kind of defense he is facing. Look for Florida to get rid of the ball quick. You'll probably see a lot of receiver screens. Florida's a 7-point favorite in this game. I think this might be a little closer than that. As of right now, I think Florida wins by about 5 points. I can see it being 21-16 Florida, something like that. This is not my official pick. I might change my mind. On Friday, I'm going to post on my Instagram page what my official pick will be, but I think it's going to be a very good, very low-scoring game. All right, that's it for today's episode. Thank you to everybody who's listening. Hope you enjoyed it. If I got anything wrong, please let me know. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. And also, if you don't follow me on Instagram, go ahead and follow me on Instagram as well. I'll leave a link in the description box so you can go follow me. All right, that's it for the day, guys. Thank you.